All right, good morning, brothers and sisters. As you just heard, if you didn't already figure it out, today is one of our discussion classes. We've gone through lesson number 16, and we try to do them every 4 lessons, although we only did 3 this time because we went 5 lessons the last time. So anyway, we're going to get back on track. So today is a discussion session. So we're going to just find some things to talk about in the stuff that we watched in the last few weeks here, or if we go further back than that, that's okay too. But just things that are interesting that have struck you as you've been watching the class. That's what we're going to take a look at today. So let's begin with a prayer to help guide our discussions. Dear God, thank you for the day you've given us, for the time that we have to gather here to worship and study your word. We pray at this time that as we enter into this time of study and discussion and reflection, that you would give us a recollection of the things that we've heard and seen in the videos, that you would give us an open mind to discussing and amplifying the truths that we've seen and what we see in the scriptures, and that you would guide our discussions in a way that would be productive for us, that would bring new knowledge to us, and that would be collegial in the way that we're responding to one another. We thank you for all of the things that you do for us, most of all as we think about this class, for giving us the ability to analyze and to read and to understand and to comprehend your word and the things going on around us, so that we can make sense out of our world, and in particular that we can make sense out of the instructions that you've left for us. We pray these things in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so as has been my sort of approach to this in general, does anybody have something you'd like to start talking about that we've looked at in the last few weeks, something that jumped out at you as being something that you found interesting, or that you had questions about or concerns about, whatever it might be? Anybody remember that this was a discussion week until you got here today? Because I didn't mention it last week, and that was my bad, and I didn't send out an email because I had forgotten it was a discussion week as well until yesterday, and then I realized, I probably better get a little bit more ready for that. So, okay, so any thoughts? Yes, Mark.
I was going to say, I think in these next couple chapters anyway, it talks about, the Jews, most of the Jews rejected Christ, other than the few that started our Pentecost started the church. But I think what I got a lot of it about, here's Paul. He's upset. He's worried about his own people because he's a Jew, and I think in our own life we have that same thing. There's people in our lives that we try to share the gospel with. They're friends with us. We've got family, and we feel so sorrowful because they won't accept Christ. And here's Paul lamenting, about this, and sometimes we're in that same boat. You think, why don't they believe this? Why aren't they taking it on like we have? And you can feel for Paul in the same way, but we can take it in our own lives and saying, that's up to God. All we got to do is try to do it, is give them what they can at least get started in the gospel, and then it's still up to people to make that decision. In this, it's almost the whole entire Israel that's left say no. So I think that's the sad part, and we all know the way is going to be narrow, and we keep forgetting that. We expect as soon as you talk to someone, they're going to, oh yeah, let's do that. And it's not that way in the world anymore. Yeah. It's real hard to do that.
Yeah. I think most of us grew up in an era where Christianity was, if we speak about Christianity more broadly than just the Church of Christ, Christianity was very much the mainstream thing that most people did. And so most of us, if we had people, many of us, I shouldn't say most of us, many of us, if we had people who we felt like were not obedient, it was more because they were not Church of Christ people than it was because they were not obedient in any form. They didn't believe in God or Christ or anything like that. Today, I think that pool of people who don't believe in anything is much higher. Who don't have any real faith in God or in Christ, who don't live it in any way. is much higher, and so most of us, probably all of us, have people that we know and people that we care about that we feel like, looking at the scriptures, they need the gospel and they're not obedient to it. And it is troubling, and it's a good point. I sometimes think about Paul looking at it more as an academic exercise. You know, well, there's a lot of people I need to save, and a lot of them are Jews, and I wish I could get them to listen. But he does say here, and in fact, the passage that's up here right now, great sorrow and unceasing grief. That's not just an intellectual exercise, you know. That's a real personal, felt sense of loss and sense of a failure. And for Paul, it doesn't sound like it helps very much that his mission is actually to who? Who's he been sent to specifically? The Gentiles. And so, on the one hand, he's been very successful with the Gentiles, by and large. On the other hand, the people that he most wants to listen to the gospel won't listen to it. So it's kind of like the gospel preacher who's very good at converting large crowds of people, but his own family won't listen to him or something. You know, it's that kind of a thing. And so, yeah, I think that's really very hurtful for him personally. So it's not just, wow, this is an intellectual exercise and why this isn't working the way it ought to. This is a personal thing to him. So I think it's a really good point. At the same time, he is struggling with that second aspect of the question, because when you look in the Old Testament, a lot of the prophecies to the Jews talk about a restoration and that all of Israel is going to be saved, or the Israelites are going to come back, or different things like that. And so Paul is wrestling with that philosophical question at the same time that he's wrestling with this sense of loss of his own people not wanting to be part of the gospel. How does do you guys see that he reconciles that idea that all Israel is prophesied as being saved, and yet clearly the Jews by and large are not choosing the gospel? How do you see him addressing that tension?
Not sure of the question.
Okay, so Paul says, I'm really sad that my own people are not accepted in the gospel. And yet, in the scriptures, it says that all Israel will be saved. And there's these passages that say that the Israelites are going to turn back to God. How does he reconcile the fact that they're not choosing to follow the gospel with the fact that the Old Testament says that they will, or seems to say that they will?
I was going to say, I notice he goes back to Abraham.
Okay.
And he goes back to, Israel will be a different Israel. It won't be this fleshly Israel anymore. It'll be more spiritual, and it'll be from the heart and the faith that Abraham had. And that seems to where he's trying to go to, and include the Gentiles also in that, not just the Jews. But he's trying to say it's all the time it was about the heart and about them doing the same thing. And I think he's trying to get there, and that's what he tries to say, I think, through this, is that Israel is a different Israel than the fleshly Israel.
Okay.
I think that's where
I would agree, because he uses the term spiritual Israel, and he's definitely making a distinction. Jerry?
You look at Isaiah and how often, or throughout all of Isaiah, he goes from condemning the Israelites to saying, I'm going to forgive you. I mean, it's back and forth. And in both cases, I think, Paul recognizes that this prophecy is a hyperbole. I mean, it's not intended to be every person, because Nehemiah they were saved by faith. So I mean, it took individual action, but at the same time, God's promise was that it was going to be available. And I think that's what he tried to say in Isaiah, is that it's up to you. God's promise is there. He's willing to forgive you. You just have to take advantage of it.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Linda.
I think Paul understands better than most people, because he was a highly educated Pharisee. He was like them, And when he had that direct experience on the road and he became a Christian, and now, you know, he says he'd rather be accursed than, you know, and having that sorrow and grief for them, because he's been there, he knows, in his new life, in his mission and everything he did, he wishes he could still get them to relate. But I do think he has a very unique perspective.
And I think, so I want to pick up Jerry's thought first and then kind of work our way through some of those. And if you have a thought, raise your hand and feel free to share it too. We're not done with this discussion, but I think Jerry makes a good place for us to start at, which is one of the things that Paul says is, in fact, if we jump forward, I think it's at the beginning of Romans chapter 10. Let me see if this is, come on. There we go. Okay, so, a little bit further along. Oh, I may have missed it.
What you looking for?
I'm looking for where he says they did not all heed the good news. Okay, yeah. Oh, wait a minute. There we go, right there. It was actually on the screen as I'm saying. This is what I'm looking for. It's not worked out well. So he says, even when we were talking about the Israel of the Old Testament, when the law of Moses was still operative, not everybody who was under the law of Moses followed the law of Moses and was saved. Even though he said it, this is the hyperbole thing, even though it says all Israel will be saved, you can look at people that were part of Israel. King Ahab is a great example, or someone like Saul. I mean, I'm picking kings because they kind of stand out, but the nice thing with the kings is at the end of, and if you look in Chronicles, at the end of every king's life, what does the book of Chronicles do for you? Yeah, you got to look at the book of Chronicles a little bit.
I don't have my hearing aids.
Okay.
So you're good.
So, well, you're going to miss some of this probably.
Yeah.
But, okay, so at the end, in the book of Chronicles, it does this a little bit to a lesser extent in the book of Kings, but the book of Chronicles, if you look, where at the end of every king's reign, it's going to say so-and-so reigned for so many years, and then so-and-so died, and then it says something else. It says, either he did evil in the eyes of the Lord or he did right in the eyes of the Lord. There aren't very many that get he did right in the eyes of the Lord. And usually the ones that do it, there's like a caveat. He did right in the eyes of the Lord, kind of. It wasn't as bad as the other guys were. It wasn't as good as David was. David's the standard, basically. And so it goes through. And so it's easy to use the kings as an example because we kind of know. It actually says he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And Ahab is a great example of someone who did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Saul did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So while it's presumptuous for me to say what their eternal destination is, it certainly would seem to be Paul's point that some of those people were Israelites. No question about it. Ahab, Saul, Omri, these guys, they were all Israelites. And yet, they were not saved, even though they were Israelites, because they weren't obedient to what God wanted them to do. Either as kings or on a more fundamental level, simply as Israelites. They didn't obey the law of Moses. So Paul says it's faith and hearing and obedience that actually bring about salvation. And so if under the old law, it was possible for Israelites, and it is true that Israelites who were Israelites were still not saved, then God must not be meaning literally all of fleshly Israel, and this gets us to Mark's point, is going to be saved. Because that's not what happened. So what God must mean is either hyperbole, as Jerry says, or he is using the word Israel to mean something different. And this is where Paul goes back to before the law of Moses and says, let's look at Abraham. So Abraham's relationship with God, was it based on law or based on faith? Faith. Okay, now, does that mean that Abraham was not obedient to God?
No.
No, he was obedient to God because of his faith, right? So Abraham's obedience flowed out of his faith, but was not a matter of law. And Abraham's righteousness, the scriptures say, came because he believed God, not because there was some set of laws that he followed to make himself righteous. Okay? In fact, one of the most profound statements that God says to Abraham is, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless or righteous. God says to him, walk with me, do what I tell you to do, go where I tell you to do, have faith in me, and I'm going to make you righteous. Not that you're going to be perfect and you're never going to mess up, but I'm going to make you righteous because of your faith and your willingness to obey me. So Abraham stands for the principle that the old law is not inherently necessary for what? Salvation. Okay? The old law is not necessarily the way that can make us righteous. It is not necessarily something that has to be done or had in order to be righteous, in order to be saved. Which means that our relationship with God doesn't have to depend on the old law, and Israel, even though they had the old law, isn't necessarily going to be saved simply by having the old law. That it's because of faith that that's ultimately the fundamental characteristic that God has been honoring all along, obedient faith. And so now, when you intervene, or not intervene, you fulfill the old law through the sacrifice of Christ, being that sacrifice that fixes the problem that the sacrifice of all the animals couldn't fix. Now you revert back to the principles of Abraham, that faith and obedience are the keys to our relationship with God and not a bunch of laws. Now, does that mean that there aren't rules and expectations for us to follow anymore? No. I noticed what Camp, in fact it was just last week that Camp talks about this, what he says about this where do our commands and rules come from now as Christians?
Where does the commands come?
Where do all the commands and rules that we follow as Christians today, where do those come from?
Do you mean the New Testament?
That certainly is part of it, yeah. So one of the areas is that they come from the New Testament. And what's the first commandment, the biggest commandment, Jesus says? Love the Lord your God. And the second one is? Love others as yourself. And so we know that that's what we've been commanded. And Jesus says, a new command I give you, which really isn't a new command, because it's kind of ironic, really. A new command I give you, love one another. Wasn't that you wonder sometimes one of the apostles might not have, some of the questions they asked were clearly kind of dumb, and Jesus got kind of mad. But can you imagine that would have been the one I would have asked probably, is, didn't you actually say, love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself? Wasn't that one of the things you told us a while back that was in the law? But anyway, yeah, okay, love your neighbor as yourself, or love one another, okay, is the command that Jesus gives us. So we have that, and that then defines or opens up a realm of expectations for us that stem out of that, okay? But does that mean that everybody gets to just make up their own definition of what love one another means? No, you're shaking your head no, Linda, why not?
Well, because we still have to follow what the word says. And, and you were saying the difference between the Old and New Testament. If it's retaught, some of the Old Testament stuff, we need to follow it too.
Okay. So one of the big ones is that we see things retaught. Now the most extreme example of this that we see is over in, I think it's Acts chapter 16. I may be a little early there, where there's this argument over, it's not 16. There's an argument over what Paul is teaching, and whether Christians have to convert to Judaism, have to follow all the rules of Judaism in order to be saved. Let me see if I can find this here. Yeah, it's actually earlier than 16, I believe. There it is, yeah, 15, okay. So there's this disagreement. Paul is in Antioch of Syria, which had by that time become probably the center of Christian evangelism, because Jerusalem, first of all, not quite as well located for it. Second of all, the Jews in Jerusalem, the Jewish Christians, were not as financially capable of supporting the work. Antioch had become, they were the ones that sent Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey and had sent out a bunch of other missionaries. So they've become the center of missionary outreach, which is primarily focusing on who?
Gentiles.
Gentiles, not the Jews anymore. And so what happens in 15 is, it says, "Some men came down from Judea, began teaching the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved." Now, the indication Paul gives in Galatians is they were adding other things as well, but circumcision was their big thing, okay? You gotta be circumcised. Because, and in Romans, Paul talks about they are not those who are only Jews outwardly. And when he says Jews outwardly, what he's almost certainly talking about primarily is circumcision. The one way you can tell a Jew apart from all the Gentiles during this time period is circumcision. Everything else you'd have to watch them for a while, but if you just wanted to go up and check real quick, and you didn't mind getting punched in the nose probably, that would be the way you would find out, okay? So these men come down and they say, you gotta be circumcised. And Paul gets into an argument with them. They go to the church in Jerusalem because that's the mother church, that's where all the apostles still are. And they have this big council, this big discussion between the two sides, the apostles, and the whole church is there. The Jerusalem church is there watching this go on, although they're not directly interacting or intervening in this as this happens. So this goes along, both sides kind of present their views, and Paul's got kind of a trump card because these guys that are coming to say, you got to be circumcised, that's their whole argument. They got to be circumcised. That's what the law says, they got to be circumcised. And Paul and Barnabas pull out, well, okay, so let's look at the facts. We've gone here, we went here, and we went here, and we went here, and we converted people, we baptized them, and the Holy Spirit came on them, and some of them are doing miracles, and none of them are being circumcised. That's not a great place to be if you're on the other side of that argument, because the evidence is very much on their side. And so what happens is that the church and the elders, well, the elders and apostles talk about this, and they come back to the church and they say, we've got this idea, and we think that we ought to just let the Gentiles do what the Gentiles are going to do. And in fact, it's one of the, I forget which of the, I think it's James, who says, look, you know, it's already, look at how pain it was for us to be Jews, and how bad we were at it. Do we really want to make a bunch of other people have to do that? So let's just make it as easy as possible. And so they end up writing a letter to the Gentile churches, and what do they do say, first of all, there's a bunch of people came out, and they're making you worried because they're saying all these things, they didn't come from us. So in fact, we are glad to hear about you, and we think you're doing good things, and so we're sending these people with you along with Paul and Barnabas, or maybe it's Silas, Barnabas, and we're sending these people with you to confirm that this is coming from us, and it seemed good to us not to give you any greater burden than what? What are the specific commands that they bring forward out of the law of Moses to the people that they're talking to?
The last one is stay away from blood.
Okay, that's the one, that's the easy one to remember. Don't eat blood, okay? Abstain from blood, actually. Okay, what else?
Anything that was sacrificed to idols.
Okay, so food sacrificed to idols, or things sacrificed to idols. What else? Two other things. Four things they said.
Strangled.
Okay, things that are strangled, which is actually tied into the blood thing, because if you strangle an animal, the blood stays in the meat, and it doesn't drain out the way it does if you kill it some other way. And then one last thing. Fornication, sexual immorality. Okay? Those are the four things. Now, three of those things are things that are pretty much law of Moses exclusive. The Gentiles probably, Christian Gentiles probably understood to stay away from idolatry in general. But not eating food sacrificed to idols is something that they would not necessarily have considered. And Paul will later tell them, hey, even with regard to that, if nobody tells you it's sacrificed to idols, you don't have to go look and find out. You just need to keep away from it if you know that that's what's happened. Not because it's going to lead you into idolatry, but because you'd be giving a bad impression on the people. And then the only one of those that is something that really is older than the law of Moses is the sexual immorality or the fornication thing. That one's been a problem going way back. And that's a moral code or a moral rule that's existed even before the old law started writing down moral codes. And so basically the Council of Jerusalem is concerned about blood, and we know from what Paul and others talk about that blood is significant because why? The life is in the blood, is what the scriptures tell us. So the life is in the blood, so stay away from the blood. God doesn't like it when you mess with the blood, okay? And then food sacrifice to idols because it supports idolatry, or it can make people think that you're engaging in idolatry. And then fornication. Now, does that mean that it's okay for the Gentiles to go and kill people, Gentile Christians? Well, they didn't say it wasn't okay. Why isn't it okay? What about stealing for people? Is it okay for the Gentile Christians to go steal for people?
Well, none of those are loving your neighbor.
Okay, so yeah, definitely. So certainly it runs afoul of that principle of love one another, or loving your neighbor. Okay, so how do we know that that's part of the principle of loving your neighbor, to not kill them?
It's in the commandments.
It is in the commandments. So remember, we're saying the Ten Commandments are not necessarily a governing force, except to the extent that they define existing principles. Okay.
I think there's an element of God's very moral law that gets into the definition that you're talking about. That God has made that very obvious that we're not to kill each other. And it's I think we can sin by violating a moral law that isn't written down.
Okay.
And that to me is something that makes it, you know, the Israelite had the same requirement, but they didn't follow it. They wanted the law. They wanted words. They wanted to be specific. Where we're required to look at a bigger picture, not every law written down. If it violates our conscience, God says it's a sin.
Okay. And so to that point, the answer is, we don't like this answer because we're legalists, whether we want to admit it or not. We all are. We live in a legalistic society. I mean, think about all the rules that we have and all the rules that we follow. And rules are not a bad thing necessarily. Why are rules good? Why can rules be good?
Well, they keep you from running into the guy crossing the street with the
All right.
traffic light.
So rules can help to structure your society in a way that keeps you from doing damage, or that supports the aims of that society. So whether it's paying taxes because we need money to run the government, or traffic laws, you don't run into the guy who's crossing the street, or whatever it is, rules have a purpose. And the larger your society is, the more critical it is that you have rules, because otherwise you can have some very widely different ways of doing things, and people who don't necessarily think the same way. But when it comes to something like this, the honest answer of, how do we know it's wrong to kill somebody is you just know it's wrong to kill somebody, It's not, there's no mystery to this necessarily. When God goes to Cain, as Cain is working himself up because God didn't accept the sacrifice, notice that at no point does God say to Cain, oh, by the way, it's wrong to kill your brother. He says, sin is crouching at your door, and it's going to, if you don't master it, it's going to consume you, and you're going to do something evil. He doesn't have to tell him that would be murdering your brother. Don't do that, because that would be evil. Cain knows it's wrong. And afterwards, when God judges Cain and punishes him, what is Cain's response? What is his defense? Or maybe defense isn't the right word, but how does Cain respond to God when God says, I'm going to mark you, I'm going to cast you out, everyone's going to know that you're a murderer?
He's afraid that everybody's going to kill him.
Okay, so his response is not, I didn't know it was wrong. His response is, if you do this to me, I will have no place to live, and everybody who sees me is going to try to murder me because of what I did. So what we can see is right off the bat, Cain knows what he did was wrong, even though it had never been formally commanded in the scriptures that we can see anyway, that was something you shouldn't do. Okay? So a lot of moral imperatives exist in our conscience, and I think that's part of what Paul's talking about in Romans chapter 1 when he says, what is true about God and the creation is evident from the creation. We know that it's wrong to kill people. We know that it's wrong to take other people's stuff without their permission. We know that it's wrong to commit adultery. We know that it's wrong to do certain things because it's built into us. Now, does that mean that everybody believes that? Everybody sees it that way?
No.
No. Linda?
Well, when Jesus was talking to the rich young ruler,
Mhm.
he reiterated, you know the commandments, and he said them. So he did emphasize them again.
Right.
So we know that those are still
And,
true.
well, and also in that context, that was still the system that they were under. He said, what must I do to be saved? And Jesus said, you know the commandments, love you, and he lists off several of the commandments in there. And they are the ones that he specifically lists off are ones that are interpersonal things. He doesn't hit on the Sabbath or whatever in that context. So there's an aspect of that to it, but also that's still under the old law. You follow those commandments, do what it says, and then he says, your problem is what to the rich young ruler? Your problem, the thing that's getting in the way of your salvation is what? Your money. The stuff that you have that you love too much. And we could look at that in the context and say what that probably is saying, what Jesus is saying, implying in there is that the money is getting between that that money is getting between the rich young ruler and what?
Neighbor.
Salvation.
Maybe his neighbor, or who else though?
Between his
God.
relationship with God.
It's doing something that is impeding that love the Lord your God and love your neighbors yourself. One or both of those is being impacted by his love of his money. That's coming first. And so Jesus is saying you've got to get rid of that because as long as you've got it, it's going to be getting in the way of you doing those things. Even though nowhere in the Old Testament does it say go sell all your stuff. In fact, the Old Testament says I'm going to give you stuff and be glad when you get the stuff because it proves I love you. You know? So Jesus is saying something that's additional to the law of Moses. Yeah.
It makes me think about, so we have laws in place. A great portion of the world doesn't believe in God or doesn't love God or whatever. And it makes me think about where people's morality comes from. We don't murder, we don't steal because God told us not to, and we love God. So we have a fear, or we have the reverence that we love God, versus the rest of society that doesn't murder and doesn't steal for fear of punishment.
Okay. And under the Jewish system, under the old law, Paul is arguing that the vast majority of the Jews didn't murder, didn't steal because of the first of those two reasons, or because of the fear of punishment, the second of those two reasons that you gave. In many of their cases, that they were obedient to God because they were afraid of punishment or of not being saved, not because they actually loved God or had any sort of faith in Him. They were afraid because the rules had been set up to punish them if they didn't obey the law. The law of Israel, when Israel was operating the way it was supposed to, was the law of Moses. And so that was how you determine what you did, whether what you did was right or wrong. Okay? So yeah, I think when we look at our modern day society, many people, now I would say by and large, I would say that the vast majority of our society doesn't murder because they realize it's wrong to murder and it would really never occur to them seriously to do it. When we go to that one, okay? But so many of the lesser ones, the reason they don't do it is exactly what you said, and it's because they're afraid they're going to get punished. I would take that car if there was not any consequences for taking that car. That's the thought process, because, you know, I want that car. And it's just a car, you know? Well, it's not like I'm killing anybody, you know, something like that. And so yeah, I think that what happens is that we develop a tendency in a rule-based system to use the rules to define our conduct, not in terms of what's right and wrong, but in terms of what we would get in trouble for or not. David?
Just, I mean, how much of this too, this is all our interpretation, but like I know they're not explicitly put in there, the 7 deadly sins, right? But they're scattered throughout there. Just how much that blurs the line. For, you know, like how you could grab that concept also, and then you still have the 10 Commandments. I feel like Paul's having to address all that, you know?
He is, and I think so. I think he's trying to address all of that, and I think what we need to understand is, I keep saying this in my sermon series that I'm doing right now, and I think it's worth kind of revisiting in this context. Christianity is a grown-up religion, and I mean that both in the sense that as a religion, as a faith, it is grown up. It is the evolution, not evolution, that's not correct, the fulfillment of the law of Moses, of the series of covenants that had gone before. Because the law of Moses was not the first covenant, it was the very first covenant that we see in the Bible.
Keep the garden.
Okay, that's one of the first commands. That's true, but the first covenant is arguably, because Paul references it this way, the covenant of sin and death. If you sin, you die. That's the original covenant with God. If you don't sin, you live. If you sin, you die. That was what God said to Adam and Eve. But then later on, we have additional covenants, and the next big one is the covenant with Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant, walk before me and be blameless, or obedience or righteousness through faith. Then you get the law of Moses, and then you get Christianity. Now, is the gospel exactly the same as Moses' covenant with God? No, it is not. It is on the same basis as Moses' covenant with God. It's kind of like you could look at the laws of America and you look at the laws of, well, no, let's do it a simpler one. You look at the laws of Arizona and you can look at the laws of New Mexico. Are they going to be very similar in many respects?
Yes.
Yes. Are they going to be exactly the same in many respects? Are they based in the same origins as one another? Yeah. They're based in English common law modified by American history and American law. Both of them derive a lot of their structure from California, actually, because California's laws for the West have been kind of a way that we do a lot of stuff. So if you go to New Mexico, most of the things that you're supposed to do or not do here, it's going to be the same there. There's going to be a few differences, but not a lot. Steve?
To kind of get back to the whole Roman study. So we're studying Romans, and Paul is hyper-focused on trying to explain some issues, basically, between Gentile and the nation of Israel. So the nation of Israel existed long before Moses came along.
Yes.
Okay.
I had to think that through for a second. Yes, you're right, yeah. The people of Israel.
So Israel and the law are not intertwined simultaneously at the beginning.
That's true.
And so it came along. And so what Jesus noticed and what the apostles have noticed, Paul especially right here in Romans, is saying that the law of Moses, the law, okay, has descended to a works-based justification. If you're looking to be righteous by works, you fail. If you look to be righteous by faith, you can be. And so when you study Romans, you almost literally have to look at other writings in order to cement that. Because in Hebrews 11 it says, without faith it's impossible to please God. And so the lack of faith will, you're derailed right off the bat. You're not going to be righteous. James then comes in and talks about faith and works, and we have to understand what that is. So Paul doesn't address that exactly, and then as Paul is talking about several things in chapter 10, he says you need to confess, you need to believe, you need to have a faith that comes by hearing. And are those works of the law? No, they're not works. And that's where people start getting messed up. And over here in Peter, when it talks about baptism now saves us, that's not a work either. But it's all intertwined. Faith, then comes grace, righteousness, justification, obedience, salvation, baptism. It's all part of the same casserole that you cannot pick and choose what you want out of it. It's all part of the same process. And the Jews were getting it wrong by saying, no, it's just strictly works. I don't have to have faith. I'm automatically saved.
Yeah, for them it was, and for them, Paul at different times addresses the two different aspects of it. For them, it was, I'm descended from Abraham, therefore I'm saved, or I follow the law, therefore I'm saved. But there was never any element of, I believe in God and I'm obedient because I have faith and love for God. It's these other things. It's the obedience, or it's the relationship, the descent, the genetics. There's nothing else beyond that. And so, yeah, Paul is addressing this, and his conclusion is, to go back to what Mark said at the very beginning of this discussion, spiritual Israel will all be saved. Those who are obedient to God for the right reasons, out of the right relationship of faith and obedience to the gospel, they will be saved. Just as the Israelites who died long before Jesus ever came, who were faithful, were saved through Jesus' sacrifice. I'll get to you, Jim, but David actually raised his hand a little while ago. So David, what do you got for us?
Well, I just was going to add, kind of circle back to the beginning, but like trying to explain faith or Christ to somebody who, say, let's just use the example of a Mormon, is much more challenging than somebody who doesn't know God, trying to give that example. And I think, like, just for our life, but with Paul, in me, it's chapter 9, where he basically says, like, as the potter, you have the right to rebuild the clay. So he's basically telling everybody, look, God may have done this, but he has the right to change the law, and this is what we're doing now, just trying to break it down to a rudimentary understanding that they would have.
Yeah, that's true, definitely. June?
I was gonna say the one word that didn't come up was believe. You have to believe. That's very deep.
Yes. Well, that's, and belief and faith are hard to, it's hard to define those independent of each other. I don't know that you really can, but as Steve said, as you guys are kind of coming in, Paul in this part of Romans says you believe with your mind and you confess with your heart. So these are the two things that he's identifying here. Now that's not talking about the other aspects of it, but as you say, we've got to look at the whole big picture, because we see other places where what Paul says, or rather where Peter in the day of Pentecost says, that everyone who believes in Jesus will be saved. And then the men at Pentecost freak out and they're like, well, what do we do to be saved? And he says, repent and be baptized and call upon the name of the Lord. So these things are all related together, that you can't just pull them apart and pick pieces of them the way you want to. The casserole, I love that. It's, you can't, it's pretty hard to go back into the casserole and split it back up into all its little pieces, It'd be really messy if you try to do that. So once you've got the casserole, all of it goes into it. You can't just pick out what you want. Sue?
Well, one thing though is, as we are in a group and immersed in these feelings of how we should all act and expectations of it, we have to remember that some of the people that we associate outside aren't like that, because, well, a couple months ago when I lost that money, I thought maybe that guy's conscience would set in and he would call and make it all right the next day. Because that's how life should be.
So there's two things here. Number one, remember what Paul says in Romans 1. He says everything's obvious, but the first thing mankind does, they deny the existence of God, or they give up a sense of honoring God, and then they begin to deny his existence. And the more they do that, the more they get away from those things that are obvious. And elsewhere in the scriptures it talks about our consciences being seared, being burned to the point where we can't feel it anymore. Anybody in here ever burned your tongue?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I was going to say burn your finger, but burn your tongue is way more common, and it also usually heals back unless you really go number on it. What happens to your ability to taste food immediately after you burn your tongue? It goes away, right? And a lot of times it doesn't taste it, like it feels kind of raw and everything, okay? But that's what Paul's basically talking about, is when your conscience is seared, you no longer feel or recognize those imperatives of what you should and shouldn't do. And so a lot of the people around us that live in the world, they would argue that those imperatives don't exist because they don't feel them. The truth that we know as Christians is those moral imperatives do exist. They have just damaged their consciences to a point where they don't feel them anymore. That is not an excuse for not doing the right thing. That is simply the situation in which they live, and it is deadly, just as not having a sense of touch at all would be deadly to us, because we wouldn't recognize the dangers that we step on a nail. You know if you stepped on a nail. If you have no sense of feeling in your body and you step on a nail, you won't know, and you're probably going to die from the things that come along with having stepped on a nail. Okay, we got to stop because we're way over time. I appreciate all the good discussion. We will go back to watching the video again next week with week 17.